Shabbat Shalom. In the recent rise of anti-Semitism that is linked to anti-Zionism, there are two central claims that are a big part of the myths that lie beneath these two trends. One of which is the idea that Zionism is a modern phenomena. It came about in the early 1900s, and Israel blossomed. The Jewish people came to Israel to avoid and as a response to the horrors of the Shoah. The other claim is that Judaism is a beautiful faith with an ethical center, but it is not linked to the land of Israel. That also comes from a modern trend. Of course, for me, that's not how I perceive Judaism, and I assume I am speaking for many of us in this room. And when we are confronted with these claims, the challenge is, how do we respond? Not so much for what do we tell someone back, but there is sort of a gust that hits you emotionally of like, well, wait a second, that's not me, that's not right. Where do I anchor myself in my truth? And that's what brings us to this week's Torah portion. In preparing for this morning, I found a little nugget that I found very illuminating, something that I think provides a response to these challenging claims. So I invite us all to open up into our Torah portion, page 1040, chapter 8 of the book of Eikev, verse 7. Ki Adonai Elohecha meviacha el eretz tova asher nachalei mayim ayanot u'tehomot yotzim. For Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey. This is reference to the 7 species of Shivat Haminim. A land where you may eat without stint, where you will lack nothing. A land whose rocks and iron and from whose hills you can mine copper. And here we go, verse 10. Here is the key verse. Ve'achalta v'savata uve'rachta et Adonai Elohecha al ha'aretz hatova asher natan lach. When you have eaten your fill, rabbis understand that when you're full, at that moment, then you should give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. From verse 10, there is a very popular ritual that we do as Jewish people. Does anyone know what it is? Birkat Hamazon. Can someone translate what is Birkat Hamazon? Blessing of Mazon, the food, okay. I see some of our U.S. fires in the back, right? When do we say Birkat HaMazon? After we eat. Okay, very good. Of course, this Mazon, this food is not referring, as we've just learned in the text, to all foods. It's referring specifically to the land, the food that we are going to eat in the land of Israel. So the question is, what becomes of this law? Because you would think that this is a law that we would recite only when we are in the land of Israel. But the reason why I'm sure some of you nodded your heads and said this, I know what this blessing is not because during the few times that you were living in the land of Israel, maybe it was more, you recite this prayer. But no, this has been part of Jewish law, Jewish custom for the past 2,000 years. And it comes from an amazing decision by the rabbis. 2,000 years ago, right after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jewish people are now facing diaspora. And the rabbis now are going through the Torah and for the most part saying, what are we going to keep in? What are we going to keep out? A very easy move they could have taken is they could have looked at this blessing and said, well, back in the day, that's what the Jewish people do, but we no longer are going to follow that law because that blessing was only linked to that time in history when the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel. They could have also made the decision and said, and by the way, I just want to admit, if you would have asked me before I prepared for this Torah portion, I probably would have thought, I would have given you this type of answer when explaining what is the grace after meals, which is, it's a wonderful exercise in expressing gratitude to God for the bounty and beauty of this world. And the rabbis could have leaned into gratitude completely devoid of the land of Israel. And you would expect then that when we say the grace after meals, it would sound very similar to, for the most part, the opening part of our morning service that draws our attention to the beauty of the world around us, not limited to just one land or one people, but we are mindful that everyone has a soul, everyone is made in the image of God, God creates all. And then the rabbis have to decide, well, what are we going to do? And their decision is very interesting. If you have your prayer book, and I'll just guide you through this on page 87. Some of you in this room might be familiar with this. It's Friday night before we say Birkat Hamazon. Again, we're trying to get a sense where the rabbi is going to go with the blessing after the grace after meals. What are they going to do with Birkat Hamazon? We start with a psalm. And the psalm goes, Shir ha-ma'alot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion. Right, you can continue going. This is a psalm of ascent. It's a collection of psalms that were recited when people would ascend, would make aliyah to Jerusalem. So already we're getting a flavor here of where the rabbis are going to take Birkat Hamazon. Then we go to the beginning of Birkat Hamazon, and we see a beautiful blessing of God's goodness and bounty. Baruch atah Adonai hazan et hakol. A very open-ended, we thank God for creating all. But the Birkat Hamazon continues. And we see a blessing that's going to say, Baruch atah Adonai al ha'aretz ve'al hamazon. Now what's interesting here is that it's a story of Jewish history, beginning when we were slaves in Egypt. But then it ends with the verse, you shall eat and be satisfied and blessed Adonai your God for the good land that God has given you. We're starting to see this blessing be directed into a connection to the land of Israel because we just recited the verse that we said. But maybe it's still too ambiguous where we're going. Look at the next part, or listen to the next part. Have mercy, Adonai our God, on your people Israel, on your city Jerusalem, on Zion, where your glory dwells, on the royal house of David, your anointed, and on the great and holy house that bears your name. This is not a blessing about let's consider the beauty of the jungles of Africa and the deserts of the Sahara. We're really starting to focus on the land of Israel, which is linked to this week's Torah portion. Even more so, on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, we add a special paragraph. And what a wonderful time for us to focus on the importance of rest and being mindful of the world around us, not linked to the land of Israel. And we'll read the following paragraph. Adonai our God, find favor and strengthen us in your observance of mitzvot. Know Israel, especially on the seventh day, the great and holy Shabbat, for this day is considered holy by you, to loving cease from work and to rest in the fulfillment of this mitzvah as you desired. Adonai, our God, may it be your desire to grant that we not suffer trouble, pain, or distress on the day of rest. And our God, we don't end just there. May we see Zion, your city, consoled, and Jerusalem, your holy city, rebuilt, for you are the master of consolation and redemption. Even in the paragraph about the Sabbath, we link our connection to Shabbat, our experience of Shabbat, to the experience of Jerusalem. And if I'm feeling loss and tiredness on Shabbat, I link that to the distance I have from being in Jerusalem, or the distance, for the most part, of Jerusalem being its true self. And it follows with the blessing. Uvnei Yerushalayim, Yer Kodesh Merav Yameinu, Baruch Atah Adonai, Boneh v'Rachamav Yerushalayim. Amen. Thank you, God, who builds the city of Jerusalem. Not so environmental, not so linked to the creation of the world. By the way, the blessings we say before we eat are not linked to the land of Israel. They are more so, this comes from the trees, this comes from the ground. Birkat Hamazon has a very different flavor. And then there's the last blessing, and I can continue going onwards. Bless you, Adonai, sovereign of time and peace, the God who is our creator and sovereign, our strength and deliverer, the Holy One of Jacob, our shepherd, the shepherd of Israel, the sovereign who does good and increases goodness for all day after day. And you're probably thinking, well, that is a little open-ended. Don't worry, the rabbis are going to clarify for that. We don't have time to do this, but you can go through the Grace After Meals, and you will be impressed with just how much of that collection of blessings is linked to the land of Israel, a blessing that was not written, again, just 100 years ago, but we've been saying for over 2,000 years. And if that is not clear, the rabbis add a story to this blessing. And they say that that the Birkat Hamazon is made up of 4 blessings. I sort of summarized them for you just now. But each blessing has a different author. The first author is Moses. Remember, Hazanat Zakol, God creates everything. But what is really being referred to? When the Jewish people were in the wilderness, and they were completely dependent on God doing everything for them. Manna from heaven. Now look what the rabbis are doing here. They're taking what was an open-ended universal blessing, and they're saying, no, that was a time in history when we were in the wilderness, and of course, the culmination of the wilderness story is our arrival in the land of Israel. And then the next blessing, at the blessing where we are recalling that al ha'aretz ve'al hamazon, thanking God for the land and what comes from it, they say the author there is none other than Joshua. Joshua, who was the first leader when we entered the land of Israel, who led the time when we were not completely dependent on God. We had to begin to cultivate the land ourselves to be able to glean from it, and as we took our first steps as a people in the land of Israel. Then the blessing of building Jerusalem. Who do you think the rabbis gave that to be the author? None other than King David. And then we have this 4th blessing that I talked about. Provide good times for us all. And they give the authorship of that blessing to Rabbi Akiva. Now, why Rabbi Akiva? He was the martyr of the rabbis who was tortured for standing up for the Jewish people right after Jerusalem was destroyed. And the rabbis add this piece of, even though this is the lowest moment for us as a people in the land of Israel, goodness will return for us in this place and for us as a people. So this last blessing is actually one of hope. Things are challenging now. You might be living in Poland, Spain, Morocco, Babylon. But don't worry. The Birkat Hamazon tells you, we will return. The good times will return for us in the land of Israel. Birkat Hamazon, long before Hatikvah, was a prayer of hope for a return into Zion. It's also worth noting that they could have added other authors. They could have chosen leaders from outside the land of Israel. It's like, well, Jewish history continues. This is the story of our people, and we're going to add someone from the Spanish Inquisition. Even us as Americans who dwell as we learned with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, an amazing time for us as a people in the land of the United States. We don't add many American, if any, liturgy to this prayer because it is so clearly Zionistic. So, what was the impact of the rabbis' creation? They expand a verse in this week's Torah portion and say, no, even though we won't be able to live in the land of Israel at this moment, This is always our goal. And therefore, everyone must say this blessing after you finish eating, so that you will always be mindful of the fact that Israel is at the center of who we are as a people. That's what the story, that's what the liturgy guides us towards. Now, were they successful? I'll share with you two anecdotes. One is, this summer, I went to a place called Camp Mountain Chai. And I sat in the middle of their dining hall, and there was mishigas going on. You know, they did all these unique cheers. Someone had a birthday, and they they threw a pie in his face. All these interesting Camp Mountain Chai traditions. Okay? And then they invite a group of teens, and they lead Birkat Hamazon. And everyone at Camp Mountain Chai sings together, B'kol Ram. No matter where they were sitting, no matter what rituals or friends they were sitting next to, they sing these words that we just recited. Later this summer, I went to Machaneh Ramah. I went to Camp Ramah. And I sat there during their meal, and everyone's high-fiving, and everyone's running to the buffet and hanging with their friends, and all of a sudden it comes time for Birkat Hamazon, and a very different summer community comes together and sings the song Birkat Hamazon, again, B'kol Ram, with enthusiasm and energy. This Zionistic ritual, this Zionistic collection of blessings is central to these two communities that are very much linked to the Jewish tomorrow. And by the way, some people say it's all about Jewish summer camp. All we have to do is make the Jewish summer camp, and that's the end-all, be-all. And yet, in these two places that could be perceived as an end amongst just in themselves, they say, no. Even here, we link our destiny, we link our lives with the land of Israel. So when someone comes to us and says, hey, I think Israel, I think Zionism is a modern idea, this is one example of a prayer we've been saying for over 2,000 years that began and was written by people of our faith living in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. It's becoming a little bit more difficult to make it to the land of Israel, whether it be emotionally, but also physically. I don't know if anyone's tried to fly to the land of Israel recently, but it's not as easy as it used to be. Perhaps, therefore, it is all the more important that we hear the message and the voice that began in this week's Torah portion. Shabbat Shalom.